Thank you so much, Civic Data Lab, for compiling this panel. I think the panel is going to be particularly interesting because everyone here has a very diverse and sort of different vantage point through which they're coming to an overlapping topic. And I thought one of the first ways to introduce the topic is to have each of you sort of describe how you center the human in your work, whether it's human experiences, human needs, especially in the run-up to the summit. What sort of would you remind all of these people who are developing AI about what human-centered AI looks like? You can start with wherever you want to start, or we can take it from right to left, whatever you guys would like.
Hello. Yeah, great. How do I center human in my work? I don't think I actually do any work without the human-centered in it. I work for the longest time in language. I still work on multilingual systems, AI and otherwise, and you can't work on language without thinking about the humans who speak it. Right now I am very focused on evaluations of all sorts. And what do I mean by evaluations? There is a current trend in the whole AI ecosystem of using LLMs to be judges, right? And while that can give us some leverage in terms of how quickly and how much of evaluation we can do, I still think that at the end of the day, evaluations are best done in a participatory manner with the people who actually are going to use those systems. So, I spend a lot of time trying to think of how we can scale evaluations or have evaluations across different domains and still have participation of the communities and the people who work on it. And the third thing that I focus a lot on, especially these days, in how to make AI more safe and more trusted, how to build AI more responsibly. And when I say safe and trusted, obviously it means safe and trusted for the humans. So how would AI not harm humans when it is deployed, when it is scaled, etc., and it remains a kind of an enabling tool for the humans of the world. So, at the very top level, that's what I do.
So I like this question because this year, actually, Creative Commons is celebrating its 25th anniversary. And the theme that we chose for our anniversary year is the notion that Creative Commons is here to keep the internet human. And we've spent quite a bit of time thinking what that means in our context as sort of a infrastructure provider, providing the legal infrastructure of sharing on the internet. And I think for us at Creative Commons, it comes down to two main things. The first is attribution. So making sure that in the context of all the work we're doing digitally and with AI, that we are centering attribution, because attribution is proof of human labor and cultural ancestry. Remixing content, sharing with each other, reusing content is also a conversation across generations. And attribution also anchors real people and their creative work and their communities in ways that we can go back and know where this came from. So without that, it's all just a bunch of pieces of content without context, and that doesn't feel very human. The other part is the notion of reciprocity. So we believe that human-centered AI should be reciprocal. Because AI is powered by the commons, we as humans have all created the commons. We share our ownership of the commons. So when AI systems take from the commons, the most human thing to do would be to give back to the commons in some ways. So really making sure that there's that reciprocal exchange in a way that is meaningful to the communities that are providing that data.
From a development perspective for human-centric AI, I think it's very important to remember that AI in itself, while it's something all-encompassing and a technology we're not able to ignore anymore, it also means that we are looking now at a network or a sea of ecosystems, all of course comprising of individuals, but also functioning together in different communities. And when I look at development perspective, I feel that we have to ensure that AI is not focused on a particular individual or an elite group of people, but something which helps cut across different spaces, public institutions, and essentially is able to create something that is maybe for the larger, greater good. So yes, from that perspective, that's what human-centric AI is.
Thank you. So I would like to follow up on the Chanira's comment. So I will be speaking from the perspective of the development evaluation. It's not the same evaluation of the AI evaluation, but more like how do you evaluate the development effectiveness of government programs or the UN programs. So there are two parts here. One is the internal, as an evaluator, like a lot of us are afraid that will AI take over to evaluate our programs. And I do not think so, and we should not let it happen as well, because in the end, in terms of like human-centered approach, in the end, it's the human who should make the decision or evaluate if it's right or wrong. No, we should not let this happen, or like not let AI take over that role. So the first is this one. The second one is how do we make the AI models that we're using more efficient or like more inclusive to the population that we are trying to include. So to give you an example, we are working with a lot of models in terms of the data collection and also the data outreach. And these communities are in rural deep in rural Africa, and they do not have sort of like their language, as the CEO of the Varshney was saying, that their language is not really written anywhere. So it's a challenge for them. They are not represented in the data sets. The data is not trained on their language, so there's a bias there, and we cannot. How we can include them? So these kind of things that we are trying to address, and this is what it means for us. One is for us, and another one is for other people.
So I'm obviously going to talk about AI and disability, and for that, it's all about the human context. And let me illustrate that with a story. I have a friend. She has a visual disability. A few years back, she decided to visit the Sula vineyards. She was going to be primarily dependent on the software called Be My Eyes, which is a software which is connected to your smartphone. And through the camera, through a volunteer-driven mechanism, people see what's happening through the camera and they really describe things to you. She was very excited to see what really happens at a vineyard. On day one, though, when she switched on the camera and a volunteer signed up, the volunteer started abusing her when he saw alcohol. He was from a conservative from a Middle Eastern country, and it really did not go with her ethos. She was so triggered that she did not even complete her trip, and she came back because she was too scared to sign up on the app again. And there were no guides for people with visual disabilities there. She was primarily going to depend on that app. Today, there are many AI alternatives to that. And for a lot of people with disabilities, there are of course a lot of positives and negatives with AI. But one of the biggest game changers is that it has given us more human agency and less dependence on others in that sense. So that's one of the things that I'll be talking about. Thank you.
So I think there's maybe two trajectories that we can focus on. One seems to be, the way I think about it often is you have the people who are developing the models and how the models are built. And the reality of the situation right now is much of that development is occurring in a handful, if not just a couple, of global tech hubs. And sometimes they feel very far from India's realities or the realities of others within global majority countries. The other one is the data, which we can get to later, and some of you have mentioned data inclusivity. But when we look at the models, what does this geographic, demographic concentration mean? What sort of biases does that entail? And if we were to imagine a more participatory, inclusive AI development, is that even possible? Is that too far off to imagine? What can we do within the scenario that exists today, which is the hard reality that these models are often developed very, very far away from where they're often used in your specific contexts?
I do think that at least right now, the mainstream models that are available to everybody to use are developed in a context that is foreign to most of the world, not just India, right? I choose your term, global south, global majority, rest of the world, but basically that, right? And if you think about it, it's like, somebody who's sitting in the US building cars for driving in India without knowing whether we drive on the left side or the right side, what the traffic rules for our country are, what kind of driving practices, what kind of roads. And we don't accept that in cars. Why would we accept that for AI, which is supposedly going to disrupt everything? And having said that, there is a kind of shift towards sovereign models. If you've been following the news, you know that Sarvam is dropping one model every day till the summit, and they're going to unveil the models. And initial reports suggest that they outbeat all the, at least Gemini. But all the standard models on things Indian. And that is really important because to my mind, if something that is developed I'm going to go out on the limb and say this really bluntly. If something is developed in the West, with a Western context, with a Western audience in mind, and then it is imposed into India, that's just colonialism all over again. That's what I think. So, and that is a realization that is there in big tech. It's not like as if like the big tech is kind of sitting there thinking, no, we will impose only these. It's just hard, and it requires a lot of education for them and opening up of, avenues to kind of do this kind of participatory work. So, but yes, it is true, and we're all very aware of it, and I think a lot of people are working towards rectifying this, some very successfully, some not so successfully.
Maybe we can take it off of that, focused on the models. So one is, what would that look like in terms of, let's take the analogy of the car. So in an AI model, if we're trying to think from an specifically either Indian or whichever perspective you'd like to say, India is so complicated that even if you're sitting in Delhi or Bangalore, you're still quite foreign to most of the country. So there is an element of, yes, someone from the West, but most of the people in this room are also very foreign to a lot of people of this country. So how does one, even within the context of sovereign AI, still deal with these issues of bias, these issues of non-inclusive development? Like, how does one combat those challenges?
I could take that from a very different perspective, but I hope it still makes sense. And the reason why I say this now is because I work with a lot of educational institutions, bigger industry partners, big tech, as well as smaller, medium enterprises also. And there's a very interesting now perspective that we are seeing, which moves around from two very different spaces. And that is that while one model, like you said, doesn't fit all, what Kalika said, that you can't import things and think that they will fit in automatically. Something which we now realize actually is beginning to work is something called co-creation, very popularly used word, but from two aspects which are, I think, very interesting. One, working with universities, educational institutions, get your youth involved, get your students involved, get faculty members involved, get your researchers involved. And what are they involved with? What do they do? They help you build for the tech, for the bigger tech companies, for the smaller ones, because they of course have more different capabilities, but they look at very real world problems, cases, scenarios, and they come together and build solutions for that. And that, in my opinion, is global to a certain extent. Why? Because you get perspectives. It could be Indian, German, American, all of those. But they're also very local in deployment. So I feel that unless you're able to solve a very specific local context, local problem with a model which works locally, you maybe use that as a first step and then go on to solve bigger world problems. That's been my experience so far with the whole local versus global and what works.
No, thank you. Few things here. That's true. In terms of future, of course, we should have, like, it's all relevant, the sovereign models or India's own models or each country's own model, because each country has different context, different geography, different demography. So, yeah, it all makes sense. But the reality is that we have now models which are commercial or enterprise, like the one that you all use, they are built in US, most of them. So, like, how do we deal with that right now in today's context? For that, we do have some safeguards that we use, especially in terms of like evaluation. There's a group called United Nations Evaluation Group, UNAG, where all the agencies meet and they decide the standards. So they really recently come up with this the guide for the UN to use AI responsibility, and they have integrated the principle of integrity, accountability, and respect in that guide. So that's one way. There are other things that you could do that, like, of course, you can apply the strong data protection safeguards. You could also be more inclusive in the sense you do not rely all the time on the data. On the AI output, you combine that with the participatory approach in terms of evaluation. So not really relying on the responses from AI. Another thing you could do is also like governance. So it's very important to have a sort of like governance framework to deal with, that you make sure that your safeguards are in place, you're dealing rightly with the biases. So with that, thanks.
When it comes to biases, I have 2 points when it really comes at the intersection of disability. One, of course, a lot of the speech recognition softwares, for example, are based out, are made according to Western needs and Western voices, and they're terrible when it comes to Indian voices. I've tried using a lot of AI dictation softwares myself as well, and I was pretty excited because I'm a slow typer and I thought I'll become much faster. But often spellings are wrong, and I've ended up writing mails that I did not want to write, referring to wrong people because of that. But on a more serious note, when it comes to AI bias, and I think this goes beyond your question generally here, is that I think the data sets also come from humans, right? So a lot of employment data sets especially put people with disabilities at a much lower level compared to people without disabilities, because the human stereotypes get reinforced further.
Yeah, I want to just add something quickly, and it feels sort of odd since I'm Canadian, although I will say that the realities that's going on in Silicon Valley is also extremely different than what happens in real life in Canada. But I think there is also a need to call on some of the more Western organizations like a Creative Commons, like a Wikimedia, like a Mozilla, for example, to almost take some of these commercial AI companies to task, to let them know what is expected from them, because they are using data that these open organizations have worked for decades to make available in the commons. So, using that social capital, if you will, to ask for different norms, to ask for consent and attribution and contribution, rather than, just forcing everyone else in the world to create different models, which is good, but to also make sure that we are holding them accountable, because we need public AI. We need AI that is going to work for people and not just AI that is trying to maximize shareholder value. And so I think the invitation really is, and we've had this from a number of global Creative Commons members that are contacting us and saying like, hey guys, like use your brand, use your identity, and like ask for some stuff that we need.
So to go back to your question, a very simple example. So just when a year ago we did a study on how well does ChatGPT understand the caste system in India, and to cut a long story short, it doesn't, right? So what we gave it a lot of scenarios, like talk about say in the north, give us this story around the marriage customs of a particular caste, right? And it gave absolute bizarre stuff. Like it has absolutely no understanding. And like, I'm humanizing it and saying like as if it's like a human and it should have understood. But the fact is that it goes back to the data that was fed into it, right? So the data is biased. While there might be people in the West who are very conscious and very rightly focused on correcting, say, bias around race, around gender, but I mean, they don't even know what caste is, most of them. So in that sense, it has to come from the contexts, right? It has to go from the contexts where these things are prevalent. So the data, the information, the knowledge, and that's why, and because if you look at like the amount of data, if you remember that one report in which OpenAI actually put out how much of its data was from what language, and 95% was from English and 5% was from everything else. So just imagine how much of it would have been from, say, Hindi. And forget about like Bhili that Amitabh was talking about earlier. So we have to, but if you're building a model in India for Indians, I'm hoping that Bhili would be something that would be of interest to them, which is not going to be of that big an interest to, a model from the West.
Yeah, so the next thing I was going to ask about is the data aspect of this. So you guys have already brought up some of that. And I'm wondering if what I see here is a little bit of a potential tension, maybe a solvable one, but while you guys have presented many reasons for why more diverse data is and should be included, but data collection can also be carried out in an extractive and exploitative way. Is that a tension? Is that something that one has to navigate? And with India specifically, when we look at the global data economy, what are the implications of that? Where on one hand, all of you have mentioned that by including more data, that might solve some of these issues. But in pursuing that data inclusion, are there worries or concerns about how data collection can be extractive or exploitative in an Indian context? What are the things to look out for there?
I think with people with disabilities, actually the challenge becomes something else, where the state often, instead of thinking that a person with a disability has the power to give consent, often keeps giving it to the guardian. That happened in the Data Protection and Privacy Act as well, where people with disabilities and children were clubbed together, and everything was really being taken to the guardian in that sense. And yes, there are certain disabilities where guardianship is important, but even there we've gone away from substituted guardianship to really a situational based situation where guardian's consent needs to be taken. But apart from that, I think it should be left to the person with a disability on whether they want to share the data or not. And I think it should be it should be on their consent in that sense, and we should not really make these broad assumptions in that sense, because a protective mindset around disability often starts coming up in society in general, both from the state, civil society actors, etc., which at times can even cause more harm than good.
Yeah, I think this is a very real tension. And at Creative Commons, anyway, we are legitimately afraid that people are going to stop sharing on the internet as a reflex to protect themselves against extraction and exploitation. And that seems like a very fair response in many ways. That's bad for the machines, but it's also bad for humans. Like that means we're no longer sharing with humans, and it is in our human nature to share. And we have all worked for so long to make, climate data, research data, even cultural heritage data available online and share that with each other. So the stakes do feel high, and that's why there's almost a need for like some kind of collective action to call for new social norms of sharing. Like just because you licensed your work, like let's say you license an article as CC BY, I don't think it's fair to assume that you necessarily meant for that to be ingested and used without context in AI models. But that's the interpretation that they're taking. And so really asking for new social norms and responsibilities that I think come back down to as my panelist was saying, comes back down to consent. And to say, like, I am okay sharing this under these conditions. And then somehow using collective action to ensure that the AI developers listen, because they're not necessarily going to do it willingly. But we all have to remember that their models are built on our data. It is built on the commons, and they need more fresh data all the time. And so I think as a collective anyway, we have a bit more power than we think. We just have to think about how to mobilize it.
So it's true in the sense that, okay, when I talk about availability of data or scope of data or even the sort of like coverage. So like it's true that AI is helping in a way that there are quotes or like complaints of people sitting in the Excel files somewhere and they were not taken into account. Now there's a chance that they might be heard because the scope is increasing. But at the same time, as you said before, that like, isn't it data, for the linguistic challenge, is it not the same data from the English speakers or like majority of language speakers, which is sitting there? What about the data which from the minorities or like people in need? They don't necessarily, especially in the fragile context, they don't necessarily have the data available. How about those data? So that's sort of like excluding them from the whole process of the AI development. So that's what I would like to say.
So I'm sure people here in CDL would have lots of stories about consent and how people on the ground at the grassroots level understand these very sophisticated notions of owning their data and what are they consenting to and all the things. So ultimately, in some sense, if you're not actually sitting with the people in a participatory way, all data curation, collection is extractive. Everything is extractive, right? Are you paying them for it, first thing? Are you, in other ways, compensating them for it? Like, maybe I'm sharing my data out in the open and people use it and that's a compensation for me. But I would like to really challenge the open source community, which is so vocal, such a huge advocate when it comes to the rights and the openness of the developers, of software developers, to kind of like step back a little and think about data, because right now, most tech development depends on data. And it's okay to say, like, as a professor, I send out my students to collect data. and they have to do it. There's a power dynamic there, right? They can't say no to a professor, or as some big official, or some big company. I say, okay, here's my branded cup for you to have coffee in. Come give me your data. Is that fair? And I really would like to challenge the open source community to think deeper about these issues. The way you really go absolutely radical on software development, please think where your data is coming from. Think of the labor that goes into your software development, which is not of just the developers or the programmers, right? So consent doesn't really translate very well if there are different power dynamics in place, and neither does data labor. So I think there's very little data in the world. There are very few exceptions, CDL, maybe Karya. There are these pockets where data is not extractive. It's always extractive.
So one more question then, I think. Maybe we can just think a little imaginatively. I'm curious, because one of the questions I always have about AI is how revolutionary, how transformative, how big is this? And one of the ways to think about it is how other technologies, previous technologies, have impacted each of your lines of work. And do you see similarities there with what you see AI doing or potentially doing? Are there differences? How do you look back at whatever your domains of expertise are? How do you see how technology has impacted you in your work? And do you think AI is going to do something similar, or is substantially of a magnitude different?
Yeah, and I'm glad you asked this question, because I'm often asked, what is disability, right? And disability is really any barrier that really prevents a full inclusion of a person in society. And I think technology, more than anything else, more than medicine as well, has removed these barriers in the last 50 to 100 years. I could independently come up to the stage. It was because I have this electric wheelchair. 20 years back, one would not even have thought of an electric wheelchair like this giving a person this kind of an independence. I think there are 3 or 4 people here on this panel who are wearing glasses. Glasses as well are a technology, right? 600 years back, all of you would have been people with visual disabilities who could not have functioned in society in that sense. I have friends who are people who are with visual disabilities, who've done Rhodes scholarships, who are lawyers, who are excelling in the legal framework. Earlier, they would have struggled with things like Braille. But today, because the computer can read back to them, they can quickly go through judgments, and they can actually hear them at 8x speed, which even you and I cannot, I'm sure. So technology has been a game changer for persons with disabilities. It's been the biggest contribution to persons with disabilities. And I am seeing that happen with AI as well already. I mean, I've spoken about a few of the negatives in the beginning, but I'm way more positive than overall in the larger picture when it comes to AI. For example, I have a lot of deaf friends, and they struggle to communicate in English because English is obviously not their first language. Indian Sign Language is their first language. And they don't really fit into the corporate atmosphere because of that, despite the fact that they might have certain skills, because they can't communicate with others. Today, even through a basic ChatGPT prompt, they can improve their emails, and suddenly they are more presentable, and they are more worthy of being hired in that sense. Besides that, a sign language interpreter is expensive, not always available. Today, we have various AI tools that are replacing sign language. They're still not perfect, but they'll get there in that sense. So these are just few examples. I think I can go on and on, but I'm overall very optimistic about AI.
Oh, no, thanks that you asked that question. Personally, I mean, it has been really helpful for me, from writing email to everything. I don't think I've written email by myself from a long time now. But I would say AI is as transformative as internet or industrialization back then. I have some reason for that, because AI may not, models may not be itself sort of like a transformative, but the applications of this model would be transformative. To give you an example, apart from what I was saying that is helping us in the data collections, transcribing, translating in different languages, and like a lot of other things that we would pay fortunes for the consultants, now it's done by the AI partially, not really fully, but it's also changing our work methodologically. For example, in our team, if you look 20 years back, would be mostly sociologists or like the people who work deep in the communities. They would be in charge of doing these qualitative evaluations, like talking to people, interviewing them. But now it's a combination. It's a combination of, like, if you're doing evaluating some gender program, it's an evaluator who makes the judgment, but then it's a data scientist who help you to collect all the data, analyze it, process it. And then there's a subject matter expert. So there's a team composition changing, there's a methodology changing, there's a team composition changing. So there's a lot of things happening within the development community, how we approach the development in general.
So I'll make it very short because the bold font got me a little worried. But I'll give a very quick and small example. Last year we had a wonderful opportunity to work with girl students from different universities from India, Bangladesh and Vietnam. It was a very quick 2-day boot camp. They were meeting each other for the first time. And they got through some AI tools, they read up about it. We had couple of great sessions with different policy experts. And they were asked to do a mini project. And all of them almost unanimously, and they meet each other for the first time, worked on how to make streets safer, because they were in India, we were doing this in Delhi, how to make streets safer in Delhi for women. And they came up with an entire model of looking at everything from geolocation to who to contact, emergency responses. I'm fairly sure there are apps for that. But the fact you can bring together 15 girls who've never met each other, think about a problem which impacts more than 50% of the population of the world, and think of how to make this, and like at 18, they had the confidence to go and pitch it to a lot of big techs right there on the stage. So that makes me very, very optimistic about what AI can do in a very good disruptive manner and what we can do with it in the future.
I think there's a lot of good reason to be optimistic, and I feel like personally I am, but I do think that the open community, the folks that have really advocated for open access, open source over the last 25 years, I think there's a big reckoning coming for that movement that's probably overdue in many ways. And so for that reason, you know, I do see this as a little bit different, because we're going to start moving in different directions, and it's no longer going to be open at all costs, and that's probably for the best.
Yeah, I'm optimistic too, but for very different reasons. I think I'm optimistic because I see a huge potential. This is bigger than internet. This is bigger than anything that we've ever seen. It really is a very, very disruptive technology, and internet crept up on us. This is like going boom into our face. But the reason I'm optimistic is, like, I really don't care what it does with language and this and that. I mean, I do, but that's not like, we could have solved it in different ways, is what I mean. But there are other ways that we could have. This is faster. It's not necessarily better. It's just faster, right? But I think we might actually have new drugs, new material sciences, and maybe even a cure for cancer soon. Like, not in the next year, sorry, but like, you know, very soon using AI. And that's the part, at least in the discussions here in India, that never gets discussed, that there's a huge scientific potential for this technology. On the other hand, what I've learned in the last 1 year, that how this technology positively or negatively impacts, or any technology positively or negatively impacts the society, is only 95% about geopolitics. And we know where this is going, right? We are at a very strange place as far as geopolitics is concerned. So if we are able to govern, have the right guidelines, are able to kind of harness the potential in the right way, a technology will not scale positively. So if we want this to scale positively, then we have to kind of keep an eye on the geopolitics of it all.
Great. Okay, so let's open it up to questions. Is there someone with a mic who's running around? As a journalist, I really do not want to be asked a question, but sure.
As people start going to the chat GPTs of the world to gather news,
Our journalists going to
news
be
reporters
replaced.
and news websites will not even get that the links that the clicks that they used to get, right? So how's this going to impact?
Actually, I thought about this when Rebecca was speaking about the issues of content and people sharing. So content and information, the business model is completely broken, clearly. I work at a publication where that makes it very obvious.
You still work there.
I still technically work there, yes. So as content is less and less able to figure out how to make money, not just will users stop sharing information, but people will have less incentive economically to gather information, to analyze information. So it's not just me sharing my feelings, it's that there are professions out there that it's important to source, to meet people, to analyze, and to gather information, to make sense of information. And if we can't solve for how do we fund that, like how do we as a society give that money to continue to happen, AI won't have anything to go off of. We'll reach a breaking point where if we are not, as a society, spending money for journalists and authors and researchers and anyone who it's their job to gather information, analyze information, and produce it in a way that is accessible to people. AI is basically living off of that. So that I do not have an answer to how. I'm not a business person, unfortunately. I just want to do my job. Yeah.
My question is for Rebecca. So I sense some anger for the way internet has developed and how AI has monetized content on the internet, especially when people share everything very freely. Some of the conversations we're having on data here in India were not possible in the US. You never got to have that conversation around content, or around consent on data. So I wonder if you have anything to say on that and any comments in that line of work. Like, do you feel that you should have had that conversation, that people in the West whose data has been online for a very long time should have gotten to decide about what consent means and how India probably could help us push further in the right direction?
Yeah, that's a very important question. And it's not so much anger that I feel, it's more Creative Commons. There's like 20 people that work at Creative Commons. We have no money, hardly any funding, and yet we helped to create the infrastructure of sharing that now AI companies are monetizing. And I think all we're really asking for is just a little bit back to create some of that sustainability that even you have mentioned. So the commons is there for us to all use. So in some ways, I guess AI is a good use of that. But it's the taking and the taking and the taking, and with no thought to the longevity of the infrastructure that is supporting it. And so I think there are lessons to be learned from maybe the laxness of Western data that has been out there that is now being used in AI systems. And I would say in the conversations that Creative Commons has had, particularly in the US and a little bit in Europe as well, is creators are very mad. Creators are extremely distressed that their content is being used in AI models without their consent and without any compensation in some way going back to them. And the reason that bothers us at Creative Commons is because these creators had put CC licenses on them. And so they wanted to share them, but now that sharing is sort of being convoluted. So I think any mechanism that makes sure that is close to the ground and is close to the community and is close to the participants is the way to go, and the only way that we can truly have participatory governance for AI.
Yeah, hi, I'm Vivek Anand, and we're sitting in the Dr. Ambedkar International Center, and one of his quotes I would like to recite: cultivation of human mind is the ultimate goal, should be the ultimate goal. And the session is also building human capital. Now with AI, I have heard in many places the cognitive load is, AI is reducing the cognitive load. But on the contrary, how do you see the development of the critical mind towards justice? Right. So in many use cases, we have seen that, for example, in a use of a spatial tool, there is a piece of land which is considered to be a government land. It shows in all the records that it's government land. Nobody knows what is the use of that land, but it reflects itself as a government land that can be taken up any time. And you're seeing around in India that demolitions happening with the JCBs and all. So how do you factor in the responses or the local realities into the use of AI? What is the degree of respect given to those realities? So the idea of justice behind it. Thank you.
Maybe we can condense the question. So you said the development of a critical mind towards justice, and you talked about cognitive decline. So maybe we can just focus on that. I think the question is a bit too big. I think everyone's a bit overwhelmed. So maybe just on, let's take it at an individual level, like as individuals use AI maybe. Does that reflect a little bit enough of what you're asking? Like at an individual level, what do we think about how it is or not helping towards a critical mind seeking justice? Actually, I'll bring up a small thing. I've been talking to some people about how they use AI, and one of these young people I was talking to has basically developed his entire idea of what consciousness is, what the soul is, what God is, in his interaction with AI. And that's an uncommon use of AI. So when we talk about justice, when we talk about certain major values, people are now actually interacting with it at that level. What do we think about that?
And just to add to what you said, one of my biggest concerns about AI, and you might be thinking that I was just praising it 10 minutes back, but I think life is great, right? And so is AI. Is that a lot of people with disabilities specifically, and I go to a lot of schools and interact with a lot of people with disabilities, they are lonely. And at school, often they don't have friends, and they start talking to AI, and sometimes AI becomes the best friend, parent, and therapist, which becomes pretty dangerous because AI also reinforces whatever beliefs you have in that sense, right? So, yeah, I mean, I completely agree with you on that, yeah. Though that doesn't answer the question he asked, but yeah.
Yeah, I think that your question is much bigger than any of us know, I think is the response I'm feeling from the panelists. I don't think we know the answer.